Ah, the Night of Despair. The one true waifu of the Lobotomy Corporation universe. You know, some people might find it counterintuitive that I consider an abnormality to be a true waifu. Essentially, a horror movie monster that will kill your ass in a split second without even the slightest bit of remorse. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, that I said waifu and not wife. There's a major distinction there. A wife requires a highly dedicated foxman in a ring, while the other one is basically just slapping a serial number onto a 2D character before throwing them into your personal bias Pokédex. Just so that you can argue with other weebs later on about how your waifus are better and that their waifus are shit tier, because it's always a fucking funny conversation. Anyway, tangents aside, I wanted to go on a tear on this video with how I feel about the Briah level abnormality battles. I planned for this to be as long a video as it takes to convey my thoughts appropriately. I even wrote a proper script for it as well. Jesus Christ. The reason for this is because I want to take a good look in hindsight about these battles rather than just give my opinions about them at the time that I did the fight, since I don't really have a lot of time to consolidate my thoughts and form a proper opinion, so we're going to do that here. I want to really tear into these battles and take a look at them both objectively and subjectively. The focus is going to be on objectivity, though. I know that Project Moon focuses on story immersion and all of that, but make no mistake, guys, there is objectivity in how to amplify a subjective experience. Like I said, the point of the video is to take a really good look about the good, the bad, and the ugly about these fights and form a proper opinion about them. I have a tendency to be very reactive when playing video games, and it tends to give people the impression that I'm giving the fight less credit than it deserves. Many of you are well aware that I'm just a very salty fox when I'm playing games, and thus you don't take my first take of an experience literally. However, people perceive things differently. That's another topic of discussion entirely, however, so I digress. The first fight that we're going to take a look at is the one, the only, Queen of Hatred. I'll be frank with you, ladies and gentlemen. The Queen is indisputably the best fight in the game by my own opinion. However, that'd be lame to leave it off on that. I don't want to leave it on in my opinion, so we're going to dive deeper into how I can prove that claim and then qualify it. The Queen of Hatred, as we all know, is the first VoV-level abnormality you fight in the game. She was very infamous in the prequel, if you're unaware, and was known as being quite a pain in the ass to handle because her status was directly affected by the number of employee deaths in your facility, meaning that she was very likely to escape and wreak havoc a lot. She is also one of the 3 magical girl abnormalities that all correlate to one another in both lore and appearance to some level. Most of you here are fans of lobotomy and you already know about this, but I still want to reiterate it and state a point that this abnormality is very important. We're not talking about Fairy Festival, we're not talking about the Heart of Aspiration. This is the Queen of fucking Hatred. She also just so happens to be the first abnormality you unlock for Briah Floor if we go by chronological order as you progress the game, and the first abnormality to have a different OST playing, which is a bit of a mix of the first and second trumpet soundtracks from the first game. Literally everything about the Queen of Hatred fight should scream out that this abnormality battle is nothing like what you've been getting used to up to this point. I can't tell you what Project Moon was thinking definitively, of course, but I think we can all agree that they really wanted to kick things up a couple of notches for this fight. Now, there is a caveat to this fight that was something that I wasn't a big fan of when I had originally done so, but I have changed my opinion about it because they kept it consistent for the other abnormalities that we'll be going through in a moment as well. If you jump straight into this battle the moment that it unlocks, before you unlock some of the pages from the next chapter, then you're gonna have a bad time, kiddo. That's not to say that the Queen is impossible necessarily, but her pages hit for some brutally high levels of damage that just simply are better than most of the cards that you have up to that point, so you're going to really need to think outside of the box if you go before you move into the next chapter. The thing that makes the Queen so difficult is a number of different things. The first is that light regeneration is a very painful thing to manage in this fight. She will not stagger, nor does she have any ads that you can kill off, so either light regen pages or emotion level increases are what you're limited to. Let's not forget that most of the Queen's attacks are ranged, and then finally there's the matter of the main mechanic, being her hysteria gauge, rather. If this fills, she transforms and then hits even harder. However, she is susceptible to staggering after her mass attack page, which is the 4th difficult hill to climb on this fight. Finally, she also marks a target as soon as the duration ends on the previous mark, or if nobody was already marked, i.e. the beginning of the fight, which makes that character receive fatal damage from all sources. This combination of mechanics makes fighting her without the pages from the following chapter very difficult, Mostly because there just isn't very much consistency in winning against her attack clashes without expending a lot of light to do so. For example, you might consider using a high-rolling single dice page to counter her. Since it's a ranged card, one attack dice is plenty if you continue to win the clash. However, most pages up to this point are very risk-reward, like Dino's 1 to 15 roll blunt page that does the paralysis as well, or Binding Arms from Gay's office. Transpierce is really the only choice that you have for the task, but Transpierce is also a 3-cost card, which means that you can't really rely on using it every turn if you follow up with a light regen page. Comparing that to Extreme Edge from the She Corporation, which costs 2 light and rolls between a fucking 6 to 12, which is a much higher base and low minimum roll, then you have very consistent value even without Valentin's passive that adds 2 to your roll. Not to mention the various other benefits from the same battle that regenerate 2 light when you use a 4-cost page, or if you have no light at all. Again, I can't tell you what Project Moon is thinking, but it's almost as if the She Corporation pages are intentionally placed in the game as a direct counter to the Queen of Hatred. They provide many tools that allow you to appropriately form a strategy to deal with her more effectively. The funny thing about the Queen is that even if you have a ton of She Corporation pages to deal with her, like other players, including myself, would suggest, you aren't even guaranteeing a win here. The Queen still hits your marked librarian like a shit brick house, not to mention that the Hysteria gauge is still a thing to deal with as well. Also, you can't forget her mass attack page. The strategy that I used recommended to just face tank the mass attack, but I went against the grain and threw in a single marionette page as a counter. It really just depends on whether or not that you can afford the extra damage or if you can afford the light cost to mitigate the mass attack page. And as I mentioned before, Hysteria is still the main mechanic. I would even argue that the Hysteria gauge is what really pulls the fight together. If you have an overpowered setup and continually win clashes against the Queen, then she's gonna go apeshit and gain a ton of health back and then transform. So there's a push and pull dynamic here, even if you are objectively more powerful than her. Alright, now I threw a lot of bullshit at you, but the reason for it is a refresher of all the information that you would need in order to understand where I'm going to pull my main point from when I explain why I think the Queen is literally the best fight in the Library of Ruina, at least for my knowledge of fights at the current moment that I've seen. My main qualifier to what I mean when I say that she is the best, quote-unquote, you didn't see me do the finger quotations there, but I did, is that I mean she's the most engaging fight that I have seen in the game thus far. A lot of fights in the library up to this point are summarized into a couple of key things that you need to keep in the back of your head when you progress. First is prioritizing your targets. Second is having as much speed dice as humanly possible. And then third is just optimizing your decks to have more recent pages that you've obtained. Now, number 3 has some nuance to it, I know, but let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen, most fights involve you just ganking one target at a time to alleviate the pressure of having a bunch of attacks to deal with. And usually the target that you gank is that one character that has 2 speed dice. Your choice of combat pages absolutely will help you progress, but they're not nearly as substantial as having a full floor of 2 speed dice characters. The more attacks that you have means the more one-sided attacks that you can do, which means that there's more damage and translates to fewer opponents to deal with and fewer attacks, alleviating that stress. These fights obviously all have their own little mechanics here and there, but it's different from abnormality battles. That's the point that I'm making here. It is absolutely nothing like the Queen of Hatred. Because of that Hysteria gauge on top of it, there is always a feeling of back and forth with the Queen of Hatred fight. It doesn't necessarily feel like you're just ganking the shit out of her. Someone, somewhere, is going to take damage, and you need to do everything in your power to keep up with her. And it isn't like the Night of Despair or the Emma and Noah boss fight where it's impossible to do damage until you fulfill a certain mechanic requirement. It's entirely up to you to be able to do that damage, and it just feels like you have a lot more agency over what is going on during this fight versus others. Obviously, there is a dynamic of RNG to it. I'm not arguing that, but the point of the matter is it feels like it is a lot more on you not being aggressive if you're not doing damage. It feels like it's more on me for that rather than just raw mechanics. She is a nice mixture of both mechanic and just non-mechanic, just engaging as hell to be able to do. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's move over to the second abnormality on the list. The Little Red Riding Hooded Mercenary. Say that shit 10 times fast, good fucking lord. So the Little Red fight is, in my opinion, one of the weirdest fights in the game thus far. It's not weird in a bad way, just weird in that it really forces you to tackle it in a different way than pretty much anything in the game has taught you up to this point. I actually was really starting to dig this fight once I understood it. The problem with what I just said is that it's really difficult to understand what exactly is going the fuck on during this fight, so that you can respond appropriately. So first off, this fight, like the Queen, will be a goddamn chore unless you have gone into the next chapter of fights to obtain some cards that just have objectively higher rolls, and so that you have some better passive setups to increase the value of said rolls, because this wolf just hits really goddamn hard, just like the Queen. Not to mention that Little Red also serves as an ally/enemy of this fight. She's kind of like Sidewinder from Transformers. Anyway, if she dies, you lose. If the wolf dies, you also lose if she didn't deliver the killing blow. Now, the main difficulty in this fight, aside from understanding what is going on, like I said, is being able to appropriately counter the wolf. You need to confidently clash and not get eaten alive by his attack rolls, and so that you can also not feed into his counter dice as well, which is another mechanic that they add in here, or in the puppets fight, depending on where the player goes, I think. We're talking about counter dice being the mechanic. Regardless, what I'm saying is that the biggest trial is not feeding that counter dice. It gives him +1 strength for every clash that he wins, which can often just lead to a terribly painful follow-up round. The best way that I have found to deal with the counter dice, in all honesty, is either to just let Little Red handle one-sided attacks against his counters, or by debuffing him yourself with combat pages or even Oink's passive, for example. A 4 to 8 defense roll is far less likely to succeed against a 3-dice combat page with Feeble on it. Plus, letting Little Red take damage here and there isn't too bad because she has a lot of cards that can heal, and there's one in particular that heals up to 12 HP if both of her attacks land. The most important thing about Little Red is that there's one attack in particular that she has that gives the wolf Feeble 5. This attack should have maximum priority to land and is worth the risk of going against her counter dice if that means that she can land the attack, because it makes his counter dice pretty much useless. Aside from the mass attack pages that are really the only other thing that sucks to deal with, Little Red introduces individual mass attacks. So let's go into that for a minute, which means that it targets individual dice on your combat pages rather than combining all of them like the summation mass attacks do. The only real counter for this is just to remember that you can't actually intercept mass attacks, so just choose the combat dice that she targets and then select the best option to attack the wolf with it, and you should be fine in most circumstances. I don't know. Little Red, in summary, is almost as good a fight as the Queen of Hatred, but just, in my opinion, the thing that tilts my head in the direction of the Queen in terms of objective quality is that Little Red is just a very misleading fight. Allow me to qualify that first before you go ahead and formulate your opinion on what I said. It's very awkward and hard to understand unless you really break down each individual page, especially what Little Red does, and then you look at the wolf. It's great and rewarding because once it actually clicks, you feel like fucking Sherlock Holmes, but between the mass attack page mechanics being kinda nebulous, even with the tutorial explaining it, and the fact that you probably don't know how to pan the goddamn camera to target Little Red, regardless of whether or not that you should attack her, it makes the fight just fall a little short of what it could have been. Look, I know that you can pan the camera, and I hate to continue my complaining about it, but the point of the matter is that why do you even have middle mouse as the pan button in the first place? Just let us click and drag with a left or a right click. It just, I don't know, it feels so unnatural. Anyway, that's all that I have to say about Little Red. She's a really great boss when she works. I just feel that not everybody is going to be able to feel that this fight, or be able to feel how well the fight feels at its best, if that makes sense. Okay, onward to the Pinocchio fight. Dear fucking lord, man. If no one's aware, I despise puppets. I hate dolls, marionettes, mannequins, or any representation of life that is artificial. It's creepy, it's unnatural, and I don't have a fear of it that I embellish just for YouTube views. It's genuinely a deep-seated uncomfortability that stems from both the marionette enemies from the original Devil May Cry game for PS2, and the fact that my grandmother used to have about 20 or so porcelain dolls on display in an old house of hers. Dolls in fake life are creepy to me. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. So the Pinocchio fight was actually quite well done. Despite my obvious bias against it, it's not something that I wanted to do, but ultimately it was a well done fight despite my lack of own personal enjoyment. One of the biggest praises that I can give it is how the ads in the fight were actually significant in some way. You see, the reason why so many people hate ad fights is because they essentially just pad out the experience. The ads don't contribute much to ad fights typically, and they only serve to distract you from the boss to add artificial difficulty, because simply having a duel with the boss itself would just be too easy. Pinocchio, on the other hand, actually decided to do something at least mildly fucking creative with an ad fight by making one of the ads constantly shuffle the light costs of your cards for each turn that it's alive, while the other one provides a consistent buff each scene to every other Pinocchio. Not only that, but each Pinocchio copies the decks of a specific librarian, which means that in theory, you could actually pick a trash deck to use with one of your librarians to make the boss Pinocchio copy it and then just be a gigantic bitch, if you really wanted to. I really wish that I could fight this abnormality fight again, or just any abnormality and fight again to test things out, because I really want to try that out now. Anyways, the point of the matter that I'm trying to put across to you guys here is that the other Pinocchios aren't just sandbags or targets that you gank as soon as possible so that you can duel the boss. They actually have weight and value to the fight. In other words, it's a good fucking ad boss. Yeah, it turns out that you can actually put those words together in a sentence, unironically. Who knew? Anyway, the main mechanic of this fight is trying to sniff out a lie that the Pinocchio uses in the form of a combat page. Since he copies your patron librarian's deck, it means that you have all the information that you need to be able to do what the mechanic is asking of you. It's not an unfair mechanic by any stretch, you just need to pay attention, really. Failure to sniff out the lie will buff all Pinocchios, meanwhile if you successfully sniff out the lie, and then counter it with the lying is bad card, then every Pinocchio will be debuffed and be susceptible to staggering, which is important because this boss is pretty fucking tanky. In summary, I really like the fight. It made me uncomfortable as hell, but it was well executed. It didn't feel like a fucking chore to do, and the mechanics were articulated to me very clearly through gameplay. It made it very clear what was expected, as well as making it very clear how I would be punished if I failed to do what was asked of me, which made the whole entire thing feel pretty rewarding, all in all. I wish I liked puppets a little bit more than I do in reality, but you know what? Hey, what's the harm in having a little bit of deep-seated fucking childhood emotional trauma being tapped into through video games every now and again, eh? I give Pinocchio a PTSD-induced panic attack out of 10. There we go. Next up is the Scarecrow fight. I hate this fight too. Not mechanically, but remember what we just went over with Pinocchio? So yes, Scarecrows count absolutely towards the things I throw in the fuck it bucket. I will say that the Scarecrow is a really good starting abnormality for Chesed, of all people though, considering that he's arguably the smartest Saphira. At bare minimum, Chesed is certainly one of the smartest characters in the cast, second to Angela. I just find it really fitting that the Scarecrow in search of wisdom is on Chesed's floor, one of the wiser Saphira. I'm sure that was intentional, but anyways, I'm gonna try and be kind of brief with this one because there just isn't much that I feel like I need to say about it. Its mechanic is very simple. Every turn, the Scarecrows will cycle a speed dice between each other, and the Scarecrow that has 2 speed dice at the time will be forced to use a specific card that deals between 1 and 1 damage on each of its 4 combat dice. If this card is not countered with Harvest Wisdom, then it will instead roll a solid 4 on each attack, draining HP and also stealing cards from your hand, starting with the Wisdom card. Countering with Wisdom also deals a flat stagger damage of 20 and inflicts 3 bind and feeble to the Scarecrow. The only way to obtain more Wisdom cards is to block or evade specific attack die on the other 2 Scarecrows that are supporting the 2 speed dice one. Specifically blocking or evading it, by the way. Winning the clash does not count. The mechanic is very clear and articulated. Keep your wisdom pages up and keep countering the 2-dice scarecrows with the wisdom cards that you get, or you will have a bad time. Even if you manage not to get hit once from the Harvest Wisdom page with a page other than Wisdom, remember that you still get valuable debuffs from using Wisdom, which makes it very incentivized, and it just makes obtaining other Wisdom pages that much easier from the previously debuffed Scarecrow. This fight plays by a very specific cycle of moving in sequence from one enemy to the next and countering each attack with a specific page to fall in line with the mechanic. On one hand, it's very clear what you're doing. There's a pattern and a flow to it, and if you break the flow by screwing up a roll or reacting incorrectly, then the fight will only get harder and harder. On the other hand, there are many people who might argue that this fight is very boring because of how systematic that it is. It's incredibly predictable once you get a grasp of what's going on, and once that happens, you only need to build the correct deck to counter your enemy. For example, having 3 librarians using Sayo's page with She Corporation passives, or vice versa, it could be extremely useful here since it expands the size of your hand. I'll give Project Moon some kudos here, though, in making the true threat of the fight something a bit more outside of the box, in that the enemy steals cards straight out of your hand. They don't necessarily hit hard on their own, they simply exhaust the player of resources. It makes the fight progressively harder, limiting your options more and more until you're completely out of resources. Then you're fucked. This fight, all in all, is pretty decent because it brought something to the table that was fairly unique. Mind you, unique and good are not mutually exclusive terms. I could make a fight in the Library of Ruina where an enemy has one specific combat page that crashes the fucking game if they win the clash, and it would be completely unique. It doesn't necessarily make the fight good, though. But in terms of the Scarecrows, I will say that it is indeed a pretty solid fight. I'm not saying that this is a mark against it. Not exactly the best, but not bad by any stretch. It keeps you on your toes and forces you to really keep up with what's going on before you get overwhelmed. It's a pretty aggressive fight, more or less, and I know that there are many fights in the game that react very well to playing aggressively, but the Scarecrows kind of require a calculated aggression. Like I said, the fight is pretty well done. It's a nice change of pace to keep the abnormalities feeling a little more fresh. The thing that makes it work so well is that the fight itself is so unique, but I feel like if there were more Scarecrow-esque fights in the game, then it would feel too boring. It's sort of like the Sweeper Battle, which is honestly just a glorified Project Moon-style Zergling rush. It works because it's different, but if there were a bunch of really long fights that have a million enemies that you need to outlast, then the game would just get stale. I hope my point has been made because I'm moving on to the last fight that I want to gush about. Y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. Ah, my love. Yes, we're finally at the fight that I really wanted to talk about above all else. The Night of Despair, ladies and gentlemen. In all honesty, though, what exactly made this fight so infamous within the community? I had so many people that hyped this up as some kind of fucking RNG nightmare, and then I took one swing at her and had the time of my life. I don't really understand it. I was told that the fight had a big rebalance, so you guys are probably talking about the previously balanced version, but if we're going to be honest here, I don't think that there's too much more RNG here than in any other fight in the Library of Ruina, so I don't know. I feel like in its current state, you have a lot of agency over everything. Let's go ahead and break it all down. So, the mechanic was a little confusing at first, definitely. But since the knight herself is untargetable, you only really have one option, which is to attack the swords or at the very least defend against them. I didn't grasp the full mechanics of the fight for a bit, but since the only way to deal damage to her that I was aware of was to get the swords to impale her, then I figured, really, it was my only option. And in order to do that, you need to trigger her despair state by staggering one of her swords while she has that particular sword buffed with her blessing. This was much harder for me at the time because I didn't really have any piercing damage attacks, which is the only thing that the buffed sword is susceptible to, so I basically had to just get lucky using ineffective attacks and relying on recoil stagger from blocks. But anywho, once you whittle away at the blades until you can stagger the buffed one, you have triggered Despair State, where the Knight of Despair will then fully revive her blades and they will use different combat pages. If the blades deal no damage during Despair state, they will then impale the Knight for 50 damage, and having all 3 swords impale her will trigger a stagger, allowing for a free damage round. I don't see anyone needing to complete the full mechanic more than twice in order to defeat her, and in my opinion that's probably for the best, considering the same rules that I had highlighted with the Queen of Hatred being that she is a VoV level abnormality. I feel like the fight would be way too damn easy if you could just easily kill her with one rotation. That being said, this fight could easily annihilate you, though, if you lose clashes consistently, because she is the first abnormality that deals fucking pale damage. This was a type of damage in Lobotomy Corporation that scared me at first, but then once I dealt with pale damage and realized how rare that it was to have an abnormality with pale damage on it in the first game, I stopped caring so much, to be honest. I don't know. My point is that it wasn't as big a deal in Lobotomy to me because your agents could just heal gradually in most situations, or you could shoot a healing bullet. So mistakes could be made a bit more back in that game in terms of high damaging attacks, but seeing an attack deal the dice roll times 2 in a percent for damage is nothing short of absolutely fucking alarming in the Library of Ruina. You can't just pause the game and refill your life bar by shooting a healing bullet. More often than not, if you get hit for 40 points of damage, then just kiss those hit points goodbye. They are gone. The Knight is not fucking around for this fight. Luckily, though, the rolls aren't as high rolling for the attacks as they could be. And many of these rolls you can probably deal with using, honestly, just the Kurakumo, Wedge Office, and Salvador's pages. Or at least until Despair State kicks in. Once Despair State is in, though, once that happens, then you need to go big or go home, because she is no longer playing games. That being said, however, once you remember that these are all ranged attack cards, and assuming that you did the same strategy that I did for the Queen of Hatred, then you'll immediately remember, however, that there is a powerful counter, which is Extreme Edge with Valentin's passive. So you should be able to manage that decently if you build a setup around it. So to summarize the Knight of Despair, I thought it was a solid fight as well, and that pale damage was probably one of the scariest goddamn things that I have ever seen in this game since Boundary of Memes, and I didn't quite process just how much damage those attack rolls were doing until I rewatched the footage. I can't say that this fight was one of my favorites, though, believe it or not, as much as I am biased towards this abnormality, and that's mostly because the fight feels more cinematic than overly engaging. It's not bad, but it just works well with the theme of the fight, which is Project Moon's primary focus when designing a battle in this game, so I can't take points off for that. They make it really immersive and make it feel like it fits for the characters that are involved in-universe. There really isn't any other way to go about a fight with the Knight of Despair, in my opinion, than what they did. I mean, come on, guys. We're gonna read some parts of the Wiki Lore just for funsies here. An abnormality of despair that has gone through a repeated cycle of faith and betrayal, leaving only the emotion that is expressed through black tears. A hero of the past, who used to be a guardian of justice, she dedicated her entire life to protect the king, the state, the city, and the weak. The knight had to uphold the laws of God in pursuit of valor, chivalry, and justice. However, after a long history fought with hardship and conflict, the knight realized in retrospect that not everything was truly upheld on her watch. The truth changed a lot of people. When justice turns its back once more, several dozen blades will rove without a purpose. In shame of failing to defend once again, and in rage against the world, the swords will eventually point at those she could not protect. The knight who wanted to redeem herself by saving others was now dishonorably called the Knight of Despair, forgotten from the people's memory, just like the others. Modica references. Hey, get that out of here. That's a spoiler. Get her off screen. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up the video for now, so take it easy. I loved going on a tirade about this shit for as long as I did, and hopefully that properly encapsulates my feelings about these fights to you all. I tend to get through these fights and then just give a fucking half-assed opinion at the end of the episode, and then I never develop it, so I decided to do something different for the abnormalities that we've seen and that we've been fighting recently with the Briah floor, because honestly, they are all a bunch of bangers for fights. Anyways, though, take it easy, guys, and I will see you all later. I may or may not be introducing a new LP soon, if I still have you guys' attention as well. I planned on doing something with some of my friends a while back, but, well, I just haven't fucking seen any action get taken towards trying to get a recording session for it from any of my friends involved. And it's been 2 fucking months, so I'm just gonna go ahead and move on without them, and I have an idea for it anyway. So, that being said, I look forward to it, and I hope you guys look forward to it as well, and until the next Library of Ruina episode, so farewell, take it easy, and welcome to the Grove. I hope you all enjoy your time.